Every December, my family comes together for a cherished tradition, a 2-week vacation that wraps up just before Christmas. It's a time to reconnect, celebrate, and create memories. My family is big: siblings, their spouses, their kids, and my parents. I've always been close to them, and this annual trip feels like an anchor to our bond. This year, as usual, plans were made in advance. Conversations buzzed with excitement about destinations, accommodations, and activities. My 15-year-old daughter, Emily, and I were gearing up for another wonderful experience. However, everything changed during a seemingly ordinary conversation with my sister. It started casually enough, discussing preparations for the trip. Then, she mentioned something that made my stomach drop: buying a winter coat for Jeff. Jeff, my nephew's best friend and my daughter's relentless tormentor, was coming on the trip. My initial reaction was disbelief. How could they think this was acceptable? Emily has faced more than her share of challenges because of Jeff. She's a quirky, nerdy teenager who embraces her love for anime, video games, and all things Star Wars. While she's had her struggles with bullying, nothing compares to what Jeff has put her through. His actions are far from harmless teasing. They're deliberate, calculated, and cruel. As I absorbed the news, I couldn't ignore the implications. 2 weeks under the same roof with Jeff? It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was untenable. I voiced my concerns immediately, but my sister didn't seem to grasp the gravity of the situation. She brushed it off, focusing instead on the importance of family and tradition. In that moment, I knew this wasn't just about the trip anymore. It was about drawing a line and protecting Emily from an environment that could harm her. What was supposed to be a joyful tradition suddenly felt like a battle. My family has always been my anchor, a source of stability and love. Growing up, our parents made sure we valued one another, instilling a deep sense of connection that carried into adulthood. Despite the natural squabbles that come with having multiple siblings, we've managed to stay close over the years. This bond isn't just about shared blood. It's about shared memories, traditions, and mutual support. The annual vacation is one of those traditions. For 2 weeks, the whole family gathers in a rented house, whether it's by a beach, in the mountains, or at some quiet countryside retreat. It's a time to unplug from the demands of work and school, to relax and simply be together. Every meal is a shared experience, filled with laughter, teasing, and stories. The kids bond over games and adventures, while the adults catch up and unwind. It's a reminder of why we prioritize family, a chance to strengthen those ties. For Emily and me, this trip has always been a highlight of the year. Being a single parent, I've leaned on my family for emotional and even practical support at times. The vacation is a reprieve for both of us, a way to recharge and reconnect. Watching Emily bond with her cousins, seeing her face light up as she participates in the family's shared traditions, is something I've cherished deeply. This context makes my current dilemma even harder. It isn't just a vacation, it's a symbol of our family unity. Refusing to go feels like stepping away from something that has held us together for so long. Yet, how can I justify participating in something that would put Emily in an environment where she feels unsafe? The stakes have never been this high, and the conflict feels personal in a way that's hard to explain. Emily has always been the kind of kid who stands out, and she owns it. She's what some might call a stereotypical nerd, but she wears the label proudly. Whether she's rewatching her favorite anime series, diving deep into video games, or debating the finer points of Star Wars lore, Emily lives unapologetically in her own quirky world. It's a world that has brought her joy and helped her form strong connections with like-minded friends, but it's also made her a target. Throughout her school years, Emily has faced bullying, but she's learned to handle it with a sense of resilience and maturity. By the time she reached high school, much of the teasing faded, or so we thought. Then came Jeff. Jeff, my nephew's best friend, has been relentless. He's not just a kid with a sharp tongue. His actions go far beyond name-calling. Jeff's tormenting takes a physical, destructive form that's hard to ignore. He's the kind of bully who doesn't just try to hurt feelings. He tries to leave a lasting mark. From pulling Emily's hair to destroying her belongings, Jeff has consistently gone out of his way to make her life miserable. Despite her best efforts to stay calm, there's only so much someone can endure. Emily has described him as a nightmare, and the worst part is, I've seen it firsthand. I've intervened, talked to the school, and even met with his parents, but nothing has worked. His father's indifference and his mother's misplaced blame have made every meeting feel futile. Jeff's behavior hasn't changed, and the damage he's caused to Emily's confidence is undeniable. Emily tries to be strong, but Jeff's presence is like a shadow she can't escape. Hearing his name connected to our upcoming family trip wasn't just disappointing, it was alarming. How could I knowingly put my daughter in the same space as the person who has caused her so much pain? Emily has always approached school with a mix of curiosity and quiet determination. She's the kind of student who enjoys learning and finds solace in her niche interests. But as much as she thrives academically, socially, school has been a battleground. Middle school, in particular, was brutal. The teasing came in waves. Remarks about her interests, her clothes, even her personality. She endured it as best as she could, developing a tough skin to handle the verbal jabs. High school offered some relief. As she grew older, the teasing subsided, and she found her footing among a small group of friends who shared her passions. But while most of the world seemed to grow up around her, Jeff remained the glaring exception. He was never just another classmate. He was a force of chaos in her life. His bullying didn't stop at mocking her. It escalated in ways that were cruel and deeply personal. Jeff would wait for moments when Emily was vulnerable, finding ways to humiliate her in front of her peers. He ripped her books, stole her personal items, and once even cut her backpack strap while she was walking down the hall. Emily could endure insults, but Jeff's actions went beyond what anyone should tolerate. Each new incident felt like a calculated attack, designed to push her to her breaking point. Her resilience, however, was remarkable. Emily worked hard to keep her focus on the things she loved, refusing to let Jeff define her experience. But no one is invincible. Every time Jeff struck, it chipped away at her confidence. Watching her navigate this relentless harassment was heart-wrenching. It wasn't just a school issue. It was a shadow that loomed over every aspect of her life. When the family vacation came up, I knew she saw it as a brief escape from all of this. The idea of Jeff being part of that safe space wasn't just a disappointment. It was a betrayal of everything we fought to protect her from. The breaking point came last year during a seemingly ordinary school day. Emily came home with tear-streaked cheeks, clutching her soaked backpack as if it were the last thread of her composure. Her words stumbled out between sobs as she explained what had happened. Jeff, with his usual smirk and sense of entitlement, had stolen her backpack during lunch. While she searched for it frantically, he and his friends thought it would be hilarious to dump it into a toilet in the boys' restroom. Emily found her belongings drenched, her books ruined, and her dignity shattered. When she confronted him, the situation escalated. She lashed out verbally, but Jeff took it a step further, laughing at her frustration until she couldn't hold back. The two ended up in a physical fight right there in the hallway. Teachers intervened quickly, but by the end of the day, both Emily and Jeff were suspended for their actions. I remember sitting across from the school principal in a sterile conference room, my hands clenched in my lap as Jeff's parents arrived. His father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, uninterested in the gravity of the situation. His mother, on the other hand, wasted no time blaming Emily. "Maybe if she weren't so difficult, my son wouldn't have to put her in her place," she spat. The principal attempted to mediate, but the meeting went nowhere. Jeff didn't apologize. His parents refused to take accountability, and Emily was left with a sense of injustice that even I couldn't fix. Her belongings were damaged beyond repair, but the emotional toll was far worse. For weeks after, Emily was quieter than usual, her confidence shaken in ways I'd never seen before. This incident wasn't just another bad day at school. It was a clear sign that Jeff wasn't just a bully. He was a danger to her mental and emotional well-being. Knowing all this, the thought of sharing a vacation with him wasn't something I could even consider. The annual family trip is something we start discussing months in advance. It's a group effort, with everyone pitching in to decide on the location, accommodations, and activities. This year was no different. Plans were shaping up, and Emily and I were looking forward to it. After the challenges of the past year, a change of scenery felt like exactly what we needed. Conversations about packing lists and travel arrangements filled our group chats. My siblings buzzed with excitement, talking about cozy nights by the fireplace and snowball fights for the kids. Emily, who loves nature photography, was eager to explore the snowy landscapes. For her, it wasn't just about the trip, it was a chance to leave behind the pressures of school and find some peace. Then came the phone call with my sister. We were talking about coordinating last-minute purchases when she casually mentioned needing to buy a winter coat for Jeff. My heart sank. I must have misheard her. Jeff, the boy who had tormented my daughter, was being invited to this sacred family event? When I asked for clarification, she confirmed it, as if it were no big deal. Jeff had been a fixture in her son's life for years, practically like family to them. She explained that his home life wasn't stable, and this trip would be good for him, a chance to escape his difficult environment and experience something positive. I was stunned. Her reasoning didn't make sense to me. How could someone who had caused so much pain to my daughter be invited into our shared space, let alone for 2 weeks? The thought of Emily, who was finally starting to heal, being forced into close proximity with Jeff was unthinkable. This wasn't just an oversight, it felt like a betrayal. I voiced my concerns immediately, but my sister brushed them off, emphasizing tradition and family unity. I hung up the phone feeling more conflicted than ever. For the first time, the vacation didn't feel like an escape. It felt like the beginning of a confrontation I didn't want to have. I didn't wait long before calling my sister back. The thought of Jeff coming on the trip had been gnawing at me, and I needed to make my stance clear. When she picked up, I jumped straight to the point. Jeff couldn't come. Not after everything he had done to Emily. Her reaction was immediate and defensive. "He's not that bad," she said, brushing off my concerns as if they were exaggerated. She argued that Jeff had always been like a second son to her, and it would be cruel to exclude him, especially given his rough home life. She spoke about how he didn't have the same privileges our kids had, and how much this trip could mean to him. I wasn't unsympathetic to Jeff's struggles, but my patience was wearing thin. "What about Emily?" I asked, my voice firm. "How do you expect her to feel, spending 2 weeks in the same house as the person who's bullied her relentlessly?" Her response floored me. "Maybe it's just a crush," she said lightly, as if Jeff's behavior could somehow be chalked up to misguided affection. The idea made my stomach turn. I reminded her of the physical altercations, the ruined belongings, the meetings with the school, and most of all, Emily's panic attacks and diminished confidence. Still, she refused to back down. She spoke of family unity, of tradition, of giving people second chances. "Jeff needs this," she kept repeating, as if that alone justified everything. I countered that Emily needed safety and peace of mind, but it was clear we were at an impasse. The conversation escalated until I finally said something I hadn't planned on. "If Jeff is going, Emily and I aren't." My words hung heavy in the silence that followed. My sister tried to reason with me, but I had made my decision. The safety and well-being of my daughter came first, no matter the cost. After the heated call with my sister, I found myself reflecting on Jeff's situation. I've always been someone who tries to understand where others are coming from, and Jeff's circumstances are undeniably difficult. His parents divorced when he was young, and the instability of his home life has been evident for years. While my family grew up in a supportive, financially stable household, Jeff's life has been the opposite. The meetings I had with his parents during the school incidents painted a grim picture. His father was detached, barely paying attention to the discussions about his son's behavior. His mother, on the other hand, was quick to shift the blame. "Maybe your daughter needs to toughen up," she once said during one of our meetings, a remark that still makes my blood boil. It was clear they didn't hold Jeff accountable for his actions. And worse, they weren't providing the structure or guidance he desperately needed. I tried to reconcile this background with his behavior. Maybe his bullying came from a place of anger or frustration with his own life. Maybe he saw Emily, with her stable home and loving support system, and felt resentment. I could empathize with the challenges he faced, but that didn't change the fact that he was tormenting my daughter. Understanding his pain didn't excuse the damage he caused. My sister's plea that Jeff needs this trip replayed in my mind. Maybe he did need a break from his toxic environment. Maybe being surrounded by a caring family would offer him something he'd never had before. But why did that have to come at Emily's expense? Why should my daughter, who had already suffered enough, be the one to pay the price for Jeff's problems? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that empathy has its limits. While I could feel sorry for Jeff, my priority had to be Emily. Her safety, both emotional and physical, wasn't negotiable. Whatever Jeff's needs were, they didn't outweigh my responsibility to protect my daughter. Word spread quickly after my confrontation with my sister. Before I even had time to process the conversation, my phone was flooded with messages. My parents were the first to call, their voices calm but tinged with concern. They wanted to know what had happened, why I had made such a dramatic declaration. When I explained the situation, their tone shifted to pleading. "Can't you find a way to compromise?" My mom asked. "This trip is about family, about togetherness. Jeff's had such a hard life, and we all know how much this could mean to him." I reiterated my stance. I wasn't trying to hurt Jeff or ignore his struggles, but I wouldn't force Emily into an environment where she felt unsafe. My dad chimed in with his own version of the same argument, pointing out how much effort goes into keeping the family united. It wasn't an easy decision for me either, but their insistence made me feel cornered. The situation quickly escalated as my siblings got involved. Some sided with me, agreeing that Jeff's behavior was unacceptable and that Emily's safety should take precedence. Others, like my sister, emphasized the importance of giving Jeff a chance to experience something positive. One sibling even suggested that maybe I was overreacting, that Emily could use this as an opportunity to toughen up. The texts and calls became overwhelming. Everyone had an opinion, and somehow, I was at the center of it all. It wasn't just about Jeff anymore. It was about what this decision represented for the family. Choosing not to go felt like a rejection of the very thing that held us all together. But going felt like a betrayal of my role as Emily's protector. Caught between these opposing forces, I felt the weight of every word, every argument. The family was splitting down the middle, and no matter what I chose, it seemed there would be consequences I couldn't avoid. The breaking point came one evening when Emily overheard a phone call I was having with my parents. I had been pacing the kitchen, trying to explain for the 100th time why this situation wasn't about being petty or inflexible. It was about her safety. I didn't notice her standing in the doorway until she spoke up, her voice trembling. "He's really going, isn't he?" I turned to face her, and that's when I saw the tears welling in her eyes. Before I could respond, her breathing quickened, and she clutched her chest. It hit me all at once. She was having a panic attack. I rushed to her side, guiding her to sit down and coaching her through slow, deep breaths. Her hands shook as she gripped mine, her face pale with fear. When she could finally speak, her words came out in broken fragments. I can't go. If he's there, I just can't." Her voice cracked as she recounted everything Jeff had done to her. The hair pulling, the ruined books, the mocking laughter that still echoed in her mind. "It's not just the things he does, Mom. It's how he makes me feel, like I don't even deserve to be there." Hearing her say those words shattered me. I had known how much Jeff's bullying had hurt her, but this was the first time she had expressed just how deeply it affected her sense of worth. For a moment, I was furious, not just at Jeff, but at the entire situation, at everyone who thought this trip was worth risking her mental health. As I held her, I knew there was no room for compromise. Emily's safety wasn't negotiable, and her well-being came before any family tradition. Whatever fallout I might face from my decision, nothing could compare to the responsibility I had to protect her. The day after Emily's panic attack, my sister called again. This time, her tone was softer, almost apologetic, but her persistence hadn't wavered. "I understand how you feel," she started, "but don't you think you're being a little too harsh? Jeff's just a kid. He's been through so much already." I listened, but my patience was thin. Her arguments felt like a rerun of our previous conversation. She talked about Jeff's unstable home life, how his parents barely paid him any attention, and how much he needed this trip to experience what a real family felt like. He's not a bad kid, you know. He's just misunderstood. I cut in, my voice steady but firm. I get that, but why does Emily have to pay the price for that? She deserves to feel safe. She deserves 2 weeks where she doesn't have to look over her shoulder. My sister sighed, clearly frustrated. Look, maybe this could be good for them. Being in the same house, spending time together. It might help them work things out. Her suggestion made my stomach churn. The idea of forcing Emily into close quarters with her bully, under the guise of working things out, felt absurd. And frankly, cruel. Working things out isn't possible when one person is terrified, I said, trying to keep my composure. Emily doesn't just dislike Jeff. She's scared of him. That's not something a cozy vacation can fix. She shifted tactics, appealing to my emotions. This trip is about family. If you don't come, it's going to hurt all of us. Mom and Dad are so upset. The kids were looking forward to seeing Emily. And Jeff, he needs this break more than you realize. I paused, choosing my words carefully. I feel for Jeff. I really do. But my daughter is my priority. If Jeff needs this trip, then take him. But we won't be there if he is. Her silence was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp. You're making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be. I ended the call, realizing that no amount of explaining would bridge the gap between our perspectives. The weight of tradition hung over every conversation. For years, these family trips had been a cornerstone of our bond. A time when we all set aside our individual lives and came together to celebrate being a family. It wasn't just a vacation, it was a ritual, one that carried the expectation of participation without question. Missing it felt almost sacrilegious. But as much as I valued this tradition, it wasn't above reproach. Traditions are meant to bring people together, to create joy and a sense of belonging. They shouldn't come at the expense of someone's safety or well-being. The idea of forcing Emily into a situation where she felt unsafe just to uphold a tradition felt deeply wrong. The arguments from my family started to sound like a script. This is what we do every year. It's just 2 weeks. She can avoid him. We've always handled things as a family, so why is this time different? Each point made me question myself, even though I knew in my gut that my decision was the right one. I thought about how much these trips had meant to Emily in the past. She used to talk about them for weeks beforehand, excited to see her cousins and explore new places. But now, the trip was a source of dread. Forcing her to go wouldn't just ruin this year's vacation. It would taint all the memories she'd cherished before. Family traditions only have value if they make everyone feel included and respected. This year, that wasn't the case. Emily didn't just feel excluded, she felt actively unsafe. For me, the choice was clear. Safety outweighed tradition. Protecting Emily wasn't just a responsibility. It was the most important thing I could do as her parent, even if it meant walking away from something we'd always held dear. After my sister and I reached an impasse, my parents took it upon themselves to intervene. They invited me over one evening, hoping to resolve the conflict face-to-face. When I arrived, they greeted me warmly, but with a tension that hinted at the seriousness of the conversation ahead. We sat at the kitchen table, a familiar setting for family discussions. My mom began, her voice measured but pleading. This trip means a lot to everyone, sweetheart. We don't want to see you or Emily miss out on something so special. She spoke about the importance of family, about how these vacations had been a way to keep us all connected as we grew older and busier. It's not just about Jeff, she said. It's about keeping the family whole. My dad, ever the mediator, chimed in. We understand why you're upset. Jeff's behavior has been unacceptable, no question. But we've always believed in second chances, in giving people the opportunity to grow. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Maybe this trip could be a turning point for Jeff. If he spends time with all of us, maybe he'll see what it means to be part of a supportive family. I felt my frustration building. Their words were well-meaning, but they seemed to miss the heart of the issue. I'm not trying to punish Jeff, I said firmly, But I can't put Emily in a position where she feels unsafe, no matter how much it might help him. Her well-being has to come first. My mom looked at me with a mix of sadness and determination. You're right to want to protect her. But what if this isolates her even more? What if missing this trip makes her feel left out from the family? I shook my head, my voice steady. Emily isn't isolating herself. She's drawing a boundary, and I have to support her. If we give in to this, what message does that send her? That her feelings and safety matter less than tradition. Their silence spoke volumes. They weren't angry, but they were conflicted, torn between supporting me and preserving the family's unity. The conversation ended without resolution, and I left feeling more certain of my decision, but deeply aware of the emotional toll it was taking on everyone involved. The conflict with my sister had rippled through the family, pulling my siblings into a debate that seemed to grow louder with each passing day. What was once a unified, harmonious group felt fractured, with everyone choosing sides. I found myself at the center of a divide I never wanted, navigating the tangled web of our relationships. Some of my siblings were unequivocally on my side. "You're doing the right thing," one of my brothers said over the phone. "There's no way I'd let my kids spend 2 weeks with someone like Jeff." They shared my frustration at how lightly some of the others seemed to be taking the situation. To them, Emily's safety was non-negotiable, and they couldn't understand why anyone would suggest otherwise. Others were more sympathetic to my sister's perspective. "This is just how families work," one of my younger sisters argued during a heated group chat. "We deal with difficult people, and we find a way to get through it." Excluding Jeff just feels cruel, given everything he's been through. The tension escalated as everyone voiced their opinions, each comment digging deeper into old family dynamics. My sister accused me of being rigid, of blowing things out of proportion. I, in turn, couldn't understand her unwillingness to acknowledge the harm Jeff had caused. It felt like she was prioritizing his needs over Emily's, a sentiment that hurt more than I wanted to admit. As these arguments unfolded, I began to see patterns in how we approached conflict as siblings. Those who had always been peacemakers leaned toward compromise, urging me to reconsider. The ones who valued justice and accountability took my side, often with more passion than I expected. These differences, while subtle in most family matters, now felt stark and divisive. Amid all this, my sister and I barely spoke directly. Our relationship, once easy and full of mutual understanding, had become strained. Every interaction felt charged, as if we were both waiting for the other to relent. The closeness I had always cherished with her seemed to be slipping away, leaving me wondering how much of it could ever be repaired. Jeff's behavior wasn't just a series of isolated incidents. It was a pattern that revealed something deeper. Over time, I had pieced together a picture of who he was, or at least who he presented himself to be. Jeff was the type of kid who thrived on control and attention, often at the expense of others. His actions toward Emily weren't impulsive. They were calculated, deliberate, and persistent. From the moment Emily entered high school, Jeff had made her a target. It wasn't just teasing or juvenile pranks. It was as if he sought to diminish her, to remind her constantly that she didn't belong. He didn't just make fun of her interests. He went out of his way to destroy things that mattered to her. From tearing up her drawings to trashing her favorite books, it was clear that his goal wasn't just to embarrass her, but to undermine her sense of self. What stood out most was how Jeff escalated when he didn't get the reaction he wanted. Emily tried ignoring him at first, but that only seemed to encourage him. When she stood up for herself, he doubled down, as though he couldn't tolerate being challenged. It was a cycle. Jeff pushed, Emily pushed back, and he retaliated with something worse. When I brought this up with my sister during earlier incidents, she waved it off as boys being boys. But it wasn't normal. Jeff's persistence, his ability to zero in on Emily's vulnerabilities, suggested a deeper issue. It wasn't just about power. It was about inflicting harm in a way that felt personal. I often wondered if his chaotic home life played a role. Perhaps the lack of stability at home made him lash out in environments where he could assert control. But understanding his motivations didn't excuse his actions. Whatever his struggles were, they didn't give him the right to terrorize Emily. This pattern of behavior made it impossible for me to consider Jeff's presence on the trip as anything but a threat. 2 weeks in close quarters with someone who had spent years targeting my daughter? It wasn't just a bad idea. It was a line I couldn't cross. Emily rarely spoke about Jeff unless she had to. When she did, her words were measured, as if she were rationing how much energy she could afford to give the subject. But after the panic attack, she began to open up more, perhaps realizing that I needed to hear her perspective fully to stand firm against the growing family pressure. One night, as we sat on the couch with her favorite anime playing softly in the background, she started talking. "Mom," she said, staring at her hands, "I know you're trying to make everyone happy, but I need you to know I can't do this. I really can't." Her voice was steady, but tinged with a sadness that made my chest tighten. She recounted in detail how Jeff made her feel. It wasn't just the bullying itself. It was the way he had managed to infiltrate every part of her life at school. "It's like he wants me to feel small, like I don't matter," she said. "And sometimes, it works." She paused, struggling to find the words. "It's not just what he's done. It's how he looks at me, like he's daring me to stand up for myself so he can knock me down again. Even when he's not around, I'm thinking about what he might do next." Hearing her articulate this broke something in me. Emily wasn't just afraid of Jeff's actions. She was afraid of his presence, the constant reminder that she wasn't safe. For her, the trip wasn't an opportunity to relax or reconnect with family. It was 2 weeks of dread, knowing her tormentor would be just a room away. "Why does he get to go?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Why does his happiness matter more than mine?" It was a question I didn't have a satisfying answer for, and one that cemented my resolve. Emily didn't just need me to protect her physically. She needed to know that her voice, her feelings, and her boundaries were worth standing up for. As I mulled over the situation, I began to evaluate what going on this trip would truly mean. For me, for Emily, and for our relationship with the rest of the family. On the surface, it seemed simple. Just go. Stick to our part of the house, and avoid Jeff as much as possible. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how untenable that plan was. Emily had made it clear that Jeff's mere presence was enough to make her feel unsafe. 2 weeks wasn't a short amount of time. It was long enough for tensions to build, for boundaries to be tested, and for her anxiety to fester. Even if we managed to avoid direct confrontations, she'd still be living in constant fear of what might happen. That wasn't a vacation. It was a sentence. For me, going on the trip would mean compromising everything I'd been trying to teach Emily about self-worth and boundaries. I'd been telling her for years to stand up for herself, to demand respect from others, and to walk away from situations where she wasn't treated fairly. How could I then turn around and force her into the very environment that defied all those lessons? There was also the emotional toll to consider. Every meal, every family activity, every quiet evening by the fire would be tinged with the unspoken tension of our decision to tolerate Jeff's presence. The family might pretend everything was fine, but the reality would hang heavy between us. It wouldn't just ruin the trip, it could damage the trust Emily and I had in each other. Beyond that, I knew that attending the trip under these circumstances would set a precedent. It would send a message to both Emily and the family that her feelings were secondary to tradition, that the comfort of the group mattered more than her well-being. That wasn't a price I was willing to pay, no matter how much the family pushed. Deciding not to go on the trip carried its own weight. The moment I told my sister we wouldn't attend if Jeff was going, I knew it would set off a chain reaction. Missing the vacation wasn't just about skipping a few days of relaxation, it was about breaking a tradition that had been a cornerstone of our family's unity for years. The immediate cost was obvious. By not going, Emily and I would lose 2 weeks of bonding with the family. For Emily, it would mean missing out on cherished time with her cousins, who had always been her allies in an otherwise challenging social landscape. For me, it meant stepping away from the group that had supported me through my divorce, through the challenges of single parenthood, through everything. But the deeper cost was harder to quantify. Not going would create a rift, one that might not heal quickly, or at all. Family traditions are often treated like sacred ground, and by choosing to prioritize Emily's safety over tradition, I risked alienating myself from people who had always been my foundation. My parents, in particular, seemed heartbroken at the idea of us being absent. Their calls and messages carried an undercurrent of disappointment, even when they tried to mask it with concern. There was also the fear of how this decision might affect Emily in the long term. Would she look back and feel guilty for being the reason we stayed behind? Would she feel like she had driven a wedge between me and the rest of the family? I wanted her to know that this choice wasn't just about her. It was about what I believed was right. Yet, as I weighed these costs, I kept returning to the same conclusion. While missing the trip would hurt, it wouldn't compare to the pain of seeing Emily forced into a situation where she felt powerless and unsafe. The family might feel fractured in the short term, but protecting Emily's emotional well-being had to come first. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting the fallout, no matter how much it hurts. This conflict wasn't just about the trip anymore. It had grown into something larger, something that reflected deeper questions about family dynamics, accountability, and the way we handle harm within our own circles. At its core, it was about how we balance empathy for someone's struggles with the need to protect others from their actions. Jeff's behavior was a product of his environment. There was no denying that. He had grown up in a fractured home, with parents who seemed either unwilling or unable to guide him. But the lack of structure in his life didn't give him a free pass to torment others. By continuously excusing his actions, the family was inadvertently enabling him, reinforcing the idea that his pain could justify the harm he inflicted on Emily. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how often this dynamic plays out in families. The troubled member is given leeway because of their struggles, while the people they hurt are expected to absorb the impact for the sake of unity. It's a cycle that prioritizes the appearance of harmony over the reality of justice. And it wasn't just Jeff. This pattern echoed in the way some of my siblings approached conflict, sweeping issues under the rug for the sake of keeping the peace. Then there was the broader question of forgiveness. Some members of the family seemed to think that bringing Jeff on the trip was an act of compassion, a way to show him that he was still part of something bigger. But forgiveness without accountability isn't healing, it's permission. By ignoring the harm Jeff had caused, they weren't teaching him to grow. They were teaching him that his actions didn't matter. For Emily, this wasn't just about a vacation. It was about being seen, being valued, and being protected. Her boundaries weren't just an inconvenience, they were a line in the sand, a declaration of her worth. And for me, this wasn't just about standing up to Jeff. It was about standing up to a family dynamic that prioritized tradition over truth. If that meant enduring some uncomfortable conversations and fractured relationships, so be it. As the weeks dwindled down to the trip, members of the family began stepping in to mediate. It wasn't surprising. We'd always prided ourselves on resolving conflicts within the group, no matter how messy they became. This time, though, it felt different. The stakes were higher, and the emotions more raw. My parents led the charge, their concern evident in every word they spoke. "We just want everyone to be happy," my mom said during one of her many phone calls. She floated various ideas, each one designed to keep both Jeff and Emily on the trip. What if we make sure they're never alone together? Or maybe we could have Jeff apologize to Emily beforehand. Neither option felt feasible. Emily didn't want to hear an apology she didn't trust, and the idea of policing every interaction for 2 weeks felt exhausting. I tried to explain this to my mom, but she just sighed. It's not ideal, but isn't it worth trying? For the sake of the family? My dad's approach was more practical. He suggested that maybe Jeff and Emily could simply stay out of each other's way. He framed it as a test of boundaries, a chance for both of them to prove they could coexist. I reminded him that Emily's boundaries weren't just theoretical, they were born out of necessity. She didn't need a test, she needed protection. Other siblings chimed in with their own ideas. One proposed splitting the trip, with Emily and me arriving a week later. Another suggested that perhaps Jeff could attend just part of the vacation. But each solution felt like a compromise that left someone unhappy, or worse, still unsafe. No one wanted to directly disinvite Jeff. and I couldn't help but notice how reluctant they were to confront my sister. Each attempt at mediation left me feeling more isolated. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was that they were trying to solve a problem without fully understanding its depth. This wasn't just about logistics or temporary fixes. It was about principle. The more they tried to find a middle ground, the clearer it became that there wasn't one. In the midst of the family's attempts to mediate, I turned to a few trusted friends outside the situation for advice. I needed an objective perspective, someone removed from the tangled web of family dynamics. After laying out the situation, their reactions were swift and clear. "You're not wrong," one of my closest friends told me after I finished explaining. "You're a parent first, and it's your job to protect Emily. No family tradition or group pressure should make you compromise that." Another friend, who had been through her own battles with family conflict, sympathized with my struggle to balance protecting Emily with maintaining family harmony. "It's so hard when the people you love don't see things the way you do," she said. "But you can't let them guilt you into something that feels wrong. This is about Emily, not them." I even reached out to a therapist I'd worked with briefly in the past. Her insight was invaluable. "Your daughter's safety, physical and emotional, should always come first," she said. "It's not about vilifying Jeff or dismissing his struggles, but about recognizing that his presence has a measurable impact on Emily's mental health. Boundaries aren't about punishment, they're about protection." Despite the validation, there was no magic solution. The advice reinforced what I already knew, that I was doing the right thing for Emily. But it also highlighted just how challenging it would be to hold my ground. Family pressure is uniquely potent, and even with the best intentions, it's easy to feel like the odd one out. The outside perspectives helped clarify one thing above all. My decision wasn't about being stubborn or unkind. It was about standing by my values as a parent and as a person. That clarity made the constant back and forth with my family slightly easier to endure. Still, the road ahead felt uncertain, and the weight of being the one to rock the boat remained heavy. As the trip drew closer, the pressure from my family intensified. Every day brought a new call, message, or suggestion aimed at finding a resolution. But with each attempt, I felt more certain that the only choice I could make was to put Emily's well-being first. It wasn't a decision I reached lightly, but it was one I knew I had to stand by. One evening, after a particularly long day of back and forth with my parents and siblings, Emily approached me in the living room. She hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you want to go, I understand," she said. "I don't want to ruin it for you." Her words stopped me cold. The fact that she would even consider sacrificing her comfort and safety to preserve the trip showed just how deeply this conflict was affecting her. I took her hands in mine and looked her in the eyes. "This isn't about the trip," I told her. "It's about you. I'm not going to put you in a situation where you feel unsafe, no matter what anyone else says." Her relief was immediate, but so was her guilt. "I feel like it's my fault," she admitted. "If I could just handle it better, maybe this wouldn't be such a big deal." I assured her that it wasn't her fault, that no one should have to handle being bullied or made to feel small. "You have every right to set boundaries," I said, "and it's my job to make sure those boundaries are respected." That conversation solidified my decision. I called my parents and siblings one last time, repeating what I'd said before. Emily and I wouldn't attend if Jeff was going. The responses were mixed, some supportive, others disappointed, a few openly frustrated. But by the time I hung up, I felt a sense of peace. The decision had been made, and while the fallout might be painful, I knew I was doing the right thing. Once my final decision was made, the reaction from the family was swift and, as expected, polarizing. The group chats buzzed with disappointment, frustration, and attempts to change my mind. My sister was the most vocal, her messages alternating between guilt-tripping and outright anger. "Do you even care about this family anymore?" she wrote at one point. "You're tearing us apart over something that could be worked out if you'd just stop being so stubborn." Other siblings tried to mediate, their responses carefully worded to avoid taking sides. "We understand where you're coming from," one wrote, "but is there really no way to make this work?" We'll make sure Jeff stays away from Emily." My parents were gentler in their approach, though their disappointment was clear. My mom called, her voice tinged with sadness. "We just hate to see you and Emily missing out. This trip has always been about bringing everyone together. It won't be the same without you." Despite their best efforts, my decision remained firm. The conversations began to taper off as it became clear I wouldn't budge. While a few family members expressed quiet support, the overall atmosphere felt tense and fractured. The trip that was supposed to bring us closer together was now a source of division. Emily, for her part, seemed relieved but cautious. She stayed quiet during the days leading up to the trip, as though afraid her relief might somehow make the situation worse. I reassured her that this was the right choice, that she hadn't done anything wrong, and that we'd make the most of our time together at home. When the family finally left for the vacation without us, there was a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for the memories we wouldn't be part of, but relief that Emily wouldn't have to face Jeff in an environment where she felt vulnerable. The fallout wasn't easy, but it felt manageable knowing I had chosen what was best for my daughter. In the quiet after the family left for the trip, I had time to reflect on everything that had unfolded. The decision I made hadn't just been about one vacation or one family conflict. It had been a reflection of the values I hold most dear. It was a choice that forced me to confront what I was willing to stand for, even when it meant standing alone. One of the clearest lessons I learned was about the importance of boundaries. For too long, the focus had been on keeping the peace within the family, even when that meant sweeping serious issues under the rug. By refusing to participate in a situation that would harm Emily, I wasn't just protecting her. I was demonstrating to her that her feelings mattered, that her boundaries deserved respect, and that it's okay to say no, even when it's hard. The situation also made me think about the dynamics of forgiveness. My family had been quick to push the narrative that Jeff deserved a second chance, that this trip could be an opportunity for him to heal, but forgiveness without accountability felt hollow. Jeff hadn't acknowledged the harm he'd caused, and inviting him on the trip without addressing that harm only reinforced the idea that his behavior was excusable. It was a lesson I didn't want Emily to internalize. There were, of course, moments of doubt. I wondered if I had been too rigid, too unwilling to compromise. But every time those thoughts crept in, I reminded myself of Emily's panic attack, of her quiet resolve when she said she couldn't go. Her safety and emotional well-being weren't things I was willing to gamble with. Ultimately, this experience reinforced something I had always believed but now understood more deeply. Family is about more than tradition. It's about creating a space where everyone feels safe, valued, and respected. And if upholding that ideal meant stepping away from a tradition this year, then so be it. As the days passed and the family vacation unfolded without us, I began to notice subtle but significant changes in Emily. There was a lightness about her, a sense of relief that seemed to grow with each day. For the first time in months, she wasn't carrying the weight of anxiety about Jeff or the looming dread of how she might have to defend herself. Emily started to reclaim her space. She spent hours absorbed in her hobbies, sketching characters from her favorite shows, editing photos she'd taken, and revisiting the video games she loved. She even began talking more openly about her plans for the future, something she'd avoided in the past when her confidence was shaken. It was as though she finally had the room to breathe and focus on herself, free from the constant threat of confrontation. One evening, as we sat together watching a movie, she turned to me and said, "Thank you, Mom, for listening to me, for not making me go." Her words were simple, but they carried so much weight. For Emily, this wasn't just about missing a vacation. It was about being heard, about knowing that her voice mattered. In choosing to prioritize her safety, I had shown her that she was worth fighting for. Over time, I saw her begin to draw boundaries in other areas of her life. She started standing up for herself more with friends and classmates, speaking out when something didn't feel right. It was subtle, but it was there, a newfound confidence rooted in the knowledge that she had the right to protect her own well-being. The growth wasn't just hers. Watching her navigate this situation with honesty and courage inspired me. Emily reminded me of the strength it takes to stand firm in your values, even when it's difficult. And while the decision to skip the trip had been painful, seeing her begin to heal made it clear that it was the right one. The aftermath of the trip lingered long after the suitcases were unpacked, and the holiday season came to a close. The family dynamic had shifted in ways that felt both subtle and significant. On the surface, everyone was polite, but there was an undeniable tension that hadn't been there before. My sister and I were cordial, but distant. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt strained, marked by an unspoken layer of resentment. She hadn't outright said it, but I could tell she still believed I had overreacted. The gap between us felt wider than ever, and while I hoped time would heal it, I wasn't sure how or when that might happen. The broader family was similarly divided. Some of my siblings were supportive, regularly checking in to remind me that they understood my choice. Others were less forgiving, their disappointment lingering in the form of curt replies and fewer invitations to group gatherings. My parents, ever the peacemakers, tried to downplay the tension, but even they couldn't fully mask their sadness over how things had played out. Despite the friction, I noticed a few positive changes as well. Some family members seemed to view Jeff differently after spending 2 weeks with him. There were whispers about his behavior during the trip, little comments about how difficult he could be. While no one openly admitted that my concerns had been validated, the subtle shift in their tone made it clear they were beginning to see the issue more clearly. As for Emily, she approached the family with caution, but not fear. She stayed close to her cousins, who had been unwavering in their support, and avoided conversations about the trip altogether. I could see that she was still processing everything, but there was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, a strength that hadn't been there before. The long-term effects of this conflict weren't entirely clear yet, but one thing was certain: the family had changed, and so had I. While the distance between us was painful, it was also a reminder of the importance of standing firm in my values. Even if the road to reconciliation was long, I knew I had done what was right for my daughter. As I look back on everything that happened, I find myself reflecting on the central question that sparked so much conflict. Was I in the wrong for refusing to go on the family trip unless Jeff was disinvited? It's a question I've turned over in my mind countless times, but each time I return to the same answer. No, I wasn't wrong. This wasn't about being petty or vindictive. It was about protecting Emily. As her parent, my primary responsibility is to ensure her safety and well-being, both physically and emotionally. When I saw the toll that Jeff's behavior had taken on her, how his presence turned even the idea of the trip into a source of dread, I knew I couldn't ignore it. Choosing not to go wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The fallout from that decision was significant. My relationships with certain family members have changed, perhaps permanently, and there are moments when I feel the weight of that distance. But there's a deeper clarity that comes from knowing I acted in line with my values. Family is important, but it should never come at the cost of someone's safety or dignity. For Emily, this experience has been transformative. She's learned that her voice matters, that her feelings aren't secondary to anyone else's comfort, and that it's okay to draw boundaries, even with family. Watching her grow in confidence has been a powerful reminder of why I made the decision I did. In the end, this situation has taught me a lot about the complexities of family, the challenges of standing firm in your principles, and the strength it takes to prioritize what truly matters. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't without pain, but I believe it was the right thing to do. Sometimes protecting those you love means making hard choices and knowing when to walk away.